November. No matter the outcome, we will elect our 47th chief executive. But first, we're going to take a look back at how the president became president. This is your countdown to 47. Now to the idol of Ohio, William McKinley. Prior to becoming the 25th president, McKinley taught at a school when the Civil War began. In 1861, an 18-year-old McKinley enlisted in the 23rd Regiment of the Ohio Volunteer Infantry, where he served under the command of future President Colonel Rutherford B. Hayes. McKinley received a promotion for his heroics during the Battle of Antietam, where he drove a wagon full of rations to his troops while under heavy fire. Hayes later described McKinley as one of the bravest and finest officers in the Army. In March of 1865, President Abraham Lincoln honored the 23-year-old McKinley by commissioning him the rank of brevet major. Following the war, McKinley returned to Ohio, where he became a leading figure in his community. In 1876, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives as a Republican, where he served for 14 years. His main focus while holding this office was on tariff policy, and his endeavors ultimately culminated in the Tariff Act, which bears his name. McKinley left Congress for the Ohio governor's office in 1891 after winning the election over the incumbent. In 1892, McKinley was encouraged to vie for the Republican nomination for president, but he declined to do so, showing support for President Harrison. McKinley's popularity made him the obvious choice for the Republican nomination in 1896. He ran against populist Democrat William Jennings Bryan. McKinley beat Bryan with the widest margin of victory in 20 years. The idol of Ohio was set to become the 25th President of the United States. After President McKinley's inauguration in 1897, he quickly took action to end the Depression caused by the Panic of 1893. He called a special session of Congress to pass the highest tariff in U.S. history. While McKinley had campaigned on the issue of financial policy, it was war that soon took his focus and came to define his time in office. The Spanish colony of Cuba was in revolt against its government. This put pressure on President McKinley to do something about it. He first sought peaceable terms, but mounting tensions expedited by the sinking of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor eventually led to the beginning of the Spanish-American War. The war proved to be the shortest in American history, lasting barely over 100 days, and resulted in the acquisition of Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines as territories. McKinley, for the remainder of the term, ushered in economic prosperity. He ran for re-election in 1900 against William Jennings Bryan, where he and his new running mate Theodore Roosevelt won with a larger margin of victory than 4 years prior. The second term of President McKinley looked to bring a promising start to the 20th century. In September 1901, the 25th president visited the Pan American Expo in Buffalo, New York, where he gave an optimistic speech about the future of American prosperity and peace. Shortly thereafter, President McKinley was greeting citizens in a receiving line when anarchist Leon Czolgosz approached him with a cloth over his hand. Beneath the cloth, Czolgosz held a gun, which he used to fire off 2 shots at President McKinley. The first shot bounced off the president's coat button, but the second pierced his abdomen. McKinley died 8 days later, becoming the 3rd president to be assassinated. William McKinley served as President of the United States from 1897 until his death in 1901. Vice President Theodore Roosevelt then became the youngest president in the nation's history, where he left a legacy that would be etched in stone. I'm Eric George for Valley News Live, and this has been your countdown to 47.